It's the kind of neighborhood that defines our country. Hard-working, blue-collar. Neighbors know their neighbors, and it seems that on every block, somebody always seems to be restoring or fixing something. It's called Willey Boom.
My wife and I moved to Bristol 25 years ago. We moved to this community because we wanted to raise our kids here because of the great people and the great values and everything that's around here. And then we bought this business 11 years ago, and as soon as we did, we fell in love with this community. The Willey Boom people are quirky, they're fun, they're close-knit, hard-working people. You can't just not fall in love with them. They're just amazing, amazing people.
Anyone who grew up in Bristol had heard the name. The Willey Boom bus route took Bristolians through Fairmount and out towards Highway 421. So anyone heading east of the rail line probably took the Willey Boom bus. But where is Willey Boom? There may have been signs at one time, but there aren't any now. And as one generation replaces the other, the name may be fading into Bristol's history. Willey Boom is the southeastern area of Bristol, south of Cedar Street, bordered on the east by Paperville and King University. And depending on who you ask, somewhere west of the Southern Railroad tracks. And the southern border is the city limits or maybe a little beyond. The center of Willey Boom could be considered this Food City grocery store on Virginia Avenue. From these views, this little neighborhood looks like many neighborhoods around Bristol, but this one is different. The things that happened here around the beginning of the last century would have a lasting effect on much of Bristol, and especially on the area that is now South Holston Lake. The history of Willey Boom, along with the original source for its name, started here in Bluff City. Since the railroad came through this area in the 1850s, every lumberman who came through here on the train couldn't help but notice the stands of virgin hardwoods all over the area. In order to harvest those trees, they had to be chopped down, transported to a local sawmill where they were reduced to large lots of cut lumber, and then had to be taken to America's fast-growing cities. By the 1890s, the forest in the steep canyons of the South Holston River Valley was being harvested. This is the area that is now under South Holston Lake. The cheapest way to get the cut logs to a lumber company and a rail line was by using the South Fork of the Holston River. Get the logs to the river. The logs would float all the way down the river until they reached Bluff City, approximately 10 miles away. At Bluff City, there was a sawmill called the Willey Boom and Lumber Company. It was called that because the owner was A.F. Willey, and his mill was a boom lumber company. A boom was a long floating barrier, usually made from logs chained together and stretched out into a river to divert the logs floating down that river to the mill at the shore. Once the logs were at the shore, they were pushed and prodded to a conveyor that would pull the logs from the water and up into the mill. There are a lot of lumber mills called boom and lumber companies, and it usually means that the mill is on a river and uses that river to transport logs. The rail line that came through Bluff City was the main line that went into Bristol, so Mr. Willey had everything he needed to turn those logs from Holston Valley into board lumber for a fast-growing nation. But it was a long way down that river to Bluff City, and the town council was preparing to annex the land where the lumber mill sat. Mr. Willey started looking for other options. Bristol was a growing city, and the main rail line connecting the major cities of North America connected here. A large parcel of land was available on the city's southeastern border near Mr. Willey's home, but the Holston River went nowhere near there, nor did any other river. That was a major problem. This was the 1890s. The roads that extended from Bristol into Holston Valley were not much more than trails, wide enough to allow farm wagons to pass. And the closer a person got to the valley, the more rugged it got. Trucks hadn't been invented, and horse and mule-drawn wagons on muddy roads was not going to work. Mr. Willey decided to build a railroad. It would start in Bristol and terminate at the intersection of the South Holston River and Big Creek, a medium-sized stream coming out of the foothills of the Holston Range. The narrow-gauge railroad would be over 8 miles long. So in September of 1892, the Holston Valley Railroad became incorporated, solely owned and operated by the Willey Lumber Company of Bluff City. During the next 4 years, the rail line was built, and the mill moved and rebuilt at Bristol. While the actual name of the lumber company was the Morton, Lewis, and Willey Lumber Company, the old name, slightly modified, stuck. A lot of workers came with the mill, so the name really never changed, except eventually the "and" was dropped, and the mill in the area was called Willey Boom. The location for the mill, just outside of Bristol, was a big field in the bottom of a valley where a stream ran. It was a bit swampy in places, but the area to the east of Georgia Avenue had a large area far enough from the stream to have solid ground. This facility was going to have to accommodate logs from a southern virgin forest, so it was not unusual to have logs that weighed over 10 tons. They didn't have tractors back then, so how do you move those huge logs around? The same way that they were moved in Bluff City. But instead of floating down the river, they were dumped into a lake where they could be pushed and poked over to that same conveyor that they had used in Bluff City. So in March of 1896, the first logs were moved from the forest of Holston Valley to the Morton, Lewis, and Willey Lumber Company of Bristol, Tennessee. Mr. Willey immediately saw the potential for a fast, efficient transportation system for the people who lived in Holston Valley. It's been over 120 years since the Holston Valley Railroad was built out of Willey Boom. The lumber company and any buildings associated with the railroad are long gone. Or are they? When we come back, we'll tell you about an important historical find that we made while producing this program. Mr. Willey decided that his rails and trains should not only be used as a method of extracting logs from Holston Valley, but his investment should also benefit the people of Holston Valley. A passenger component of the Holston Valley Railroad soon became a reality. 2 cars were bought to be used, one at a time, to transport people, mail, and baggage out of the valley. Since only 1 car was to be used at a time, the cars were built as part passenger seating and part baggage. A depot was built on Georgia Avenue for the passengers, and it would also be used as the offices for the lumber company. The Holston Valley Railroad coming in from the south ended at that depot. But north of the depot in Bristol, big things were happening that would make the depot even more important.
I think we have to start from with Willey Boone is Bristol, then what was happening in the industry, south of Bristol. Bristol was expanding. There was a big development push. R.J. Reynolds was very tied into that. They acquired the property that Fairmount Forest was developed in, and that was 1888 and 89. The Fairmount Hotel was developed. Fairmount Hotel was the #1 resort in the region, and it was really pushed heavily by Norfolk and Western. They were pushing to get people down the rail from up in Virginia down into Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee. And to do that, of course, that's passenger train service. Keep in mind, the Reynolds family wanted to develop their development, which is Fairmount Forest, which became the Fairmount section of Bristol. And they had to get the people that came in from downtown out there. And of course, they didn't have automobiles at that time. This is before the turn of the century. So how'd you do that? You had public transportation.
The public transportation was a trolley car system. At first it was horse-drawn, but it was soon modernized into an efficient electric-powered streetcar. Standard gauge rail was laid in the streets leading to the Fairmount from downtown. The rails that connected the Fairmount with downtown was just a few blocks from the Holston Valley Rail Depot. That gap would soon be closed by the trolley company, and a person could board a streetcar on State Street, connect in Willey Boom, and travel all the way to the Holston River. This made the Holston Valley Depot even more important. In producing this program, we wondered if any of the important buildings associated with the passenger rail were still there. There's only 2 buildings left on Georgia Avenue that were associated with the rail company. One is this odd-shaped building that had been used as a restaurant and a small market, and this building. It's the offices for Necessary Oil, located near the present-day location where the rails crossed Georgia Avenue. This building actually looks like a depot, even the interior. According to the city directory, both the depot and the offices of the Morton, Lewis, and Willey Lumber Company were located at 1320 Georgia Avenue, which was the address of the building. Because of buildings being destroyed and new buildings being built, addresses can change, especially after 120 years. So we wanted to be sure. We started looking into the deeds and addresses, and sure enough, this building had originally been at 1320 Georgia Avenue, confirming it as the original Holston Valley Railroad Depot, a forgotten but very important building in the history of Willey Boom and the history of Bristol. The railroad to Holston Valley was narrow gauge. The trolley tracks were standard gauge, and since the main rail line was also standard gauge, any cars that were brought into the lumber yard to pick up board lumber had to be moved on standard gauge. It was complicated and required lots of workers and lots of different rail lines and car sheds. But it was about to get more complicated. According to Bristol historian, the late Bud Phillips, a mountain man was staying at the Tip Top Hotel in Bristol shortly after the rail opened. He was complaining about the July heat in the hotel. He told stories of sleeping at where Big Creek meets the South Holston, and he claimed that even in the hottest days, it was cool and quiet. Big Creek just happened to be the termination point of the Holston Valley Railroad, so when John R. Dickey, the owner of the Tip Top, overheard the man, he gathered a few of his friends, rode the train out to the place the man had described, and spent a few days camping there. The man hadn't lied. It was cool in even the hottest days, and the river there was shallow and slow enough to offer water recreation to potential visitors. The following year, John R. Dickey and a few of his associates established Big Creek Park, buying up the land and selling it in lots to Bristol's most affluent families, leaving a substantial parcel for Big Creek Resort. Now Willey Boom was not only the center for a large lumber industry, it was the launching point for a railway that connected Bristol to a resort located near what is now the base of the inside of South Holston Dam. The Willey Boom area was seeing explosive growth. In 1903, the rail was extended from Big Creek to Fish Dam, and the following year it was extended again to the community of Fields, making the entire length of the line 12 3/4 miles long. There was a stop at Ruthton, Emmett, Big Creek, Fish Dam, and Fields. The train made 3 daily trips, and a round-trip ticket cost 50 cents. With only one passenger car making the route at a time, and a full car only holding 50 people, a full route was only yielding $25 for the railroad. But the vast majority of the support for the railroad was the transportation of logs. Other people than Mr. Willey made money from this whole endeavor.
My great-grandfather moved into the area working in the lumber business, and he had the contract from the Morton Lewis and Willey Lumber Company to get all of the lumber out of the Holston Mountains for him. And they would have logging camps set up there. And they were known for being kind of rough, men up there working. My grandmother was a little kid, and she loved to go with him up there to the logging camps. And he liked it too, but his wife did not approve of that too much. And what he would do is when the lumber company would lumber an area, after it was lumbered, that property was seen as pretty near worthless because they were worn out old farms, and they could lumber the logs and then take those off, and then it wasn't worth anything, so they'd sell the property off cheap. And what Andy Smalling would do was buy that property cheap, and he was one of the first people in the area to figure out what lime did to worn out soil. And we have receipts from early 1900s where he is buying thousands of dollars of fertilizer, of lime to replenish these farms. And $1,000 and $2,000, $2,500, $2,700 in 1900 was a lot of money. That was a lot of money. So he's doing it on a big scale. He ended up owning 18 different farms in Holston Valley, and they were all productive. The other thing that I have been told that was fairly innovative about the lumber company and what they would do is once they lumbered an area, they were one of the first ones to plant trees back again after they cut down the trees.
James Francis' family has lived in this house on Smalling's Curve for generations.
They did the land swap for this property, and those were the Acres that did that. And then the Smallings came in the late 1800s, and he married the daughter of William Acred, who was the second person to have this property in that family.
The system was very efficient, clearing that virgin timber out of the steep canyons of Holston Valley. And only 14 years after Mr. Willey's mill had moved to Bristol, the forests were depleted. 2 years later, the Morton Lewis and Willey Lumber Company of Bristol, Tennessee was no more. The main mill was torn down, and most of the ancillary buildings were occupied by a company called Trim, makers of furniture and dealers in raw lumber. Toward the turn of the 21st century, Trim was producing wooden coffins for certain religious sects that required that the dead not be buried in metal coffins. In 1915, the Bristol Traction Company, the current owners of the trolley car system, acquired the line to Big Creek. They widened it to standard gauge and electrified it. Now a person could get aboard a comfortable electric streetcar on State Street and go all the way to Big Creek without changing cars. But the rail had been made profitable by the transportation of timber, not passengers. And unlike the logging business, when cold weather set in, the visitors to the park and most of the riders of the trolley to Big Creek went away. Just 3 years later, the last trolley from Bristol to Big Creek made the run, and then the line was abandoned. With the onset of World War I, steel was in high demand, and soon the old rails were pulled up and sections of the roadbed were used for the new Highway 421. When Trim moved in, they took the rail depot as their offices, but the area between Georgia Avenue and Virginia Avenue largely remained a wetland area until the 1960s, when a tunnel was constructed for the creek and the entire lot was filled in, and in the early 80s, the Food City grocery store chain constructed their Virginia Avenue store there. In 2006, Trim was used primarily as lumber storage and burned to the ground. But several companies and factories had emerged west of the rails, and Willey Boom is still considered one of Bristol's premier industrial areas. So now, when you drive back from the lake and you travel past Carl's, past Tootie's, and the new Food City, you will know that you are in Willey Boom. You will know why it's called Willey Boom and why the history of this small neighborhood has been so important for our community.